Well, thank you so much to Yigal Nizri for that very generous and thorough introduction, to all of you for coming. And I also want to thank Professor Anna Sternschiss for inviting me through the Center of Jewish Studies. I'm delighted to be here. Also, thank you to Natasha for all of the coordination and helping me make the arrangements. This is actually my first visit to Toronto, so I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. What a wonderful turnout and warm welcome. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion. Okay, I'll just get started. Okay, as mentioned, the title is Temporalities of Israel-Palestine, History, Culture, and the Politics of Time. In his 1991 book, Cry Palestine, the late journalist Saeed Abu Rish recounts a confrontation between an Israeli soldier manning a roadblock and a Palestinian youth, the author's cousin. Spotting the youth's wristwatch, the soldier asks him for the time. The youth replies that his watch is broken, but the soldier persists. "It's 10 o'clock, isn't it?" The youth evades the question. The soldier grabs his wrist, tears off the watch, throws it to the ground, and smashes it with his rifle. He then kicks the boy and orders him to return home. As Abu Rish explains, quote, "The background to this utterly absurd incident is simple. 26 August is the date the Israelis set the clock back 1 hour, but the PLO refused to follow suit and ordered West Bankers to maintain old time. My cousin was following PLO time, which annoyed the Israeli soldier, who viewed this as an act of defiance." Abu Rish, the author, asks his cousin, "Who issued instructions for you to do this?" The youth answers, "Nobody issued instructions, but the PLO tells us when to set the clock. The rest is up to us. We choose to follow PLO time." I open with this anecdote to highlight an oft-overlooked aspect of the conflict, temporality. PLO time is just one expression of a latent and continuous struggle over temporality in Israel-Palestine, whose cultural and scholarly manifestations are the subject of my talk. So I assume that not everybody here is familiar with the term temporality. What is it? We might say that it's the ontology of time. In other words, it's how we experience time and locate ourselves within it. Temporality enfolds the quotidian experience of the daily rhythms of time, which we experience in an embodied way, as well as our historical awareness of time. Think of calendars, holiday cycles, and how we understand ourselves as part of a broader epoch or moment. Like spatiality, temporality is an intrinsic element of any political, social, cultural, or religious ethos. Yet, although space and time are interdependent, space-based studies often overlook the significance of temporality. By foregrounding it here, my intention is not to downplay the centrality of land and place within the history of Zionism and the Palestinian-Israeli struggle. Instead, I'm trying to enhance and complicate our understanding of both space and time as discursive sites and as signifying categories in the cultural history of the conflict. So my talk today brings together two separate but related questions. The first concerns what I identify as a temporal turn in the study of Palestine. So I want to ask, why are scholars increasingly foregrounding temporality, especially in their multidisciplinary treatments of the conflict? My second question is how Palestinian and Israeli literatures and film negotiate temporality on the political and cultural levels. So these are questions that I'm going to be exploring at greater length for a book project, and I can only give you a brief taste today, but those are my guiding questions. So concerning my second question about temporality in literature, I want to explain that this ontology of time should be distinguished from the production of narrative temporality, or time structure in the story. It's the question of social temporality that concerns me. As two examples of the negotiation of social temporality within cultural discourse, I turn to the Palestinian writer Ghassan Kanafani's 1966 novella, Ma Tabaqa Lakum, All That's Left to You, and the Israeli writer Amos Oz's 1963 story, Navadim Vatsefa, Nomads and Viper. Of course, we find different temporalities in different phases of Israeli and Palestinian literature. So this particular period of the mid-1960s represents a kind of middle ground between the pre-partition era of 1948, whose Hebrew literature depicts daily coexistence of Palestine's ethnic groups, and the post-1967 period that's really defined by the occupation. Literature from the late 1960s and early 1970s offers a fleeting glimpse of reintegration between West Bankers, Palestinian refugees, and their erstwhile homes inside Israel, before the literature settles back into a dominant imaginary formed around separation. The two stories I read here also represent the political zeitgeist of the mid-1960s, when socialist principles reigned over Israeli and Palestinian political life. Israeli society was dominated by the Labor Party, and the organized Palestinian resistance was inchoate. Both stories enjoy canonical status in their respective literary traditions, and they've both been widely read and analyzed, but never, at least as far as I know, in juxtaposition. So without implying parity or symmetry between them, I argue that the two narratives share certain features, particularly in their treatments of time and its convergence with ideologically charged spaces, in this case, the desert. So part one of my paper concerns the temporal turn in Israel-Palestine studies from space to time. Following the more general spatial turn of the 1990s and 2000s, scholarship on Israel-Palestine, including critical historiographies, as well as related work in anthropology, literature, cinema, and cultural studies, have returned to 1948 through questions of memory and spatiality. I discern two main categories within this body of work: those that address the symbolic manifestations of pre-1948 Palestinian space, and those that attend to Israel's ongoing instrumentalization of Palestinian space. The first category, that deals with the symbolism of the pre-1948 period, subsumes Palestinian memory studies that define their objects through spatial and mnemonic approaches, including memory maps, village memorial books, and guidebooks. They integrated history, memory, and geography, utilizing photography and oral histories to document the Palestinian villages destroyed in the Nakba. This first wave of Palestinian memory studies strongly emphasized questions of space. The lost home or destroyed village concept fuses space with time in the matter of Bakhtin's chronotope. In recent years, Hebrew-based scholars have also addressed 1948 and the Nakba in Israeli Hebrew literature, culture, and landscape. A second type of spatially oriented work on Israel-Palestine incorporates multidisciplinary analyses of checkpoints, the partition wall, bypass roads, and cartography, with an emphasis on the politics of space in the present rather than on the politics of memory and memorialization. Eyal Weitzman's influential 2007 Hollow Land exposed Israel's architecture of occupation as a complex, multi-tiered project of control encompassing airspace, archaeology, and urban planning. His analysis reconceived the spatiality of the conflict as a multi-layered vertical plane, and newer work has followed his lead. Though related questions of time and temporality were implicit in the work of the 1990s and early 2000s, I find that scholarship of the past decade has turned more explicitly to questions of time in Palestinian writing and film, shifting our attention from visual spatial markers, such as photographs and maps, to representations of temporal understanding and experience. In parallel, I see a growing interest in time within scholarship on Israel and on Hebrew culture emerging from history, sociology, cultural geography, political philosophy, and literary studies. Building on formative theories and philosophies of time, such as those of Heidegger, Benjamin, Bergson, and others, the multidisciplinary work on Palestine and Israel investigates cultural manifestations of slow time and waiting, repetition and return, non-linearity, and non-sovereign time. Assuming there is a temporal turn in the scholarly discourse on Israel-Palestine, what then accounts for its emergence in the past decade? So this is one of the big questions that I want to answer. So I calibrate it with the rising prominence of the one-state idea. And I hypothesize that there may be a linkage. The longtime international liberal consensus around the two-state solution, with its holy grail of two sovereign, adjacent nation-states demarcated along the 1967 border, gave rise to a hermeneutic framework for reading Palestinian and Israeli experience, including culture, that was premised on the differentiation of Israeli and Palestinian space. The one-state condition, or one-state argument, advanced by Ali Abu Nima, Ariela Azoulay and Adi Ophir, Yehuda Shenhav, Meron Benvenisti, and others, posits that for all intents and purposes, the territory encompassing historical Palestine is already a single state. As a social space, it is very much partitioned, but the reality of intertwined economies, infrastructures, and overarching Israeli political oversight and control renders it a single geopolitical entity comprising radically different regimes of rights and citizenship, a paradoxical situation that elicits controversial comparisons, for example, to South African apartheid. The one-state solution would resolve this discrepancy by transforming the de facto shared space of a hierarchically stratified state into a democratic binational society. So that's the difference between the one-state condition versus the one-state solution. Okay, so I contend that the one-state idea also entails a commingling of different spatio-temporal ontologies and experiences within a single geopolitical entity. So it does not mitigate the powerful impulse to differentiate Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs along the lines of their historical narratives and collective memories, their identities, and their future aspirations. Instead, it grafts such difference onto temporality, giving us the present theorizations of Israeli time and Palestinian time as radically separate temporal modes. Arguably, this temporal differentiation also exists in the pre-state period when there was, in fact, a single shared space under colonial sovereignty. As we know, time plays an essential role in colonial relationships and the creation of alterity. Although I'm concerned mainly with post-1948 cultural discourse, the assumptions of allochronism and belatedness that inform Hebrew literary representations of Palestinian time are rooted in pre-1948 historical legacies of Orientalism. At face value, the idea of a temporal turn in Israel-Palestine studies implies a refocalization from Palestine as the spatialized locus of collective memory and national identity to 1948 as an epistemic event or as an ongoing syntagm of events. Following the work of Amal Jamal and Ahmed Saadi, I suggest that paradoxically, while both Palestinian and Israeli discourses of temporality are undergirded by the epistemology of exile and return, this is also the condition that divides them. In the Jewish tradition, galut, or exile, is synonymous with dispersal from Zion, and so it has a powerful spatial connotation. But galut is also seen as an existential condition of distorted temporality in which Jewish sovereignty and agency is interrupted for 2 millennia. Understood through this lens, Zionism is a project not only of repatriation, but of temporal restoration, a return to historical time, the time of Jewish agency. In a well-known syntagm, this restoration then catalyzes Palestinian exile, jettisoning Palestinians into a temporal framework of slow time and waiting. As for post-1948 Palestinian self-understanding, it has been forged largely through notions of exile, return, and deferral. Yet Palestinian waiting is also a long-term strategy of self-maintenance, popularly referred to as sumud, Arabic for steadfastness or forbearance. Against this backdrop of conflicted temporalities, Palestinian and Israeli political and cultural discourses have become suffused with temporal figurations and tropes such as sumud, as well as al-awda, Arabic for the return, hazman hatzahov, the yellow time, which is the title of Grossman's book translated into English as The Yellow Wind, and Shalom Achshav, the well-known movement, Peace Now. Part 2 is about Oz and Kanafani. So I'll return now to our two authors and their respective stories. Writers turned spokesmen and national visionaries, Amos Oz and Ghassan Kanafani, have both enjoyed large measures of fame, yet their personal destinies could not have been more different. During the period in question, Oz was a young liberal Zionist and a member of Kibbutz Hulda in central Israel. Kanafani, only 3 years older than Oz, was a committed Marxist and a stateless Palestinian refugee living a tenuous existence in Beirut. Kanafani was born in Acre in 1936, but following the war in 1948, he was displaced along with his family to a refugee camp in Syria. In 1960, he moved to Beirut, where he served from 1969 as spokesman for the Popular Front and the chief editor of its organ. In 1972, he was killed by an Israeli car bomb that also claimed the life of his young niece. Kanafani's widely acclaimed short stories and novellas reflect the aesthetics of commitment literature and social realism, while doubling as deeply psychological explorations of the trauma wrought by the Nakba. Although Men in the Sun and Returning to Haifa have been studied in depth for their treatments of time, Kanafani's lesser-studied novella, Ma Tabaqa Lakum, All That's Left to You, from 1966, an experimental work narrated from multiple perspectives, is even more germane to my inquiry. The story takes place in a closely measured 18 hours, during which Hamid, a young Palestinian refugee in Gaza, seeking to reunite with his mother in Jordan, attempts a desperate and perilous desert crossing, while his older sister Maryam, ensconced in their home alongside the married man who has seduced and impregnated her, anxiously awaits news of his fate. In the desert, Hamid intercepts an off-course Israeli soldier and takes him hostage. The narrative is interspersed with frequent flashbacks to the events of 1948 in Jaffa that precipitated the family's current moment of crisis, beginning with the Nakba and the father's death. Time is heavily thematized and even personified in the story. In a foreword to the original Arabic edition, Kanafani explains that both time and the desert should be read as characters alongside the three central figures, Hamid, Maryam, and her lover Zechariah. However, the novel's three narrating voices are those of Hamid, Maryam, and the desert, whereas time does not narrate, it is only represented. Kanafani symbolizes time primarily through the oppressive ticking of the pendulum wall clock in Hamid and Maryam's home, which guides and measures the progression of events. The critic Roger Allen notes that the wall clock's ticking corresponds both with the movements of the fetus that Maryam carries in her womb and the footsteps of Hamid in the desert. In numerous places in the story, the clock is likened to a bier, and Hamid and Maryam's aunt even dies while gazing at the clock, quote, led into death by its chime. Kanafani repeatedly uses the clock to signify a sex-death or eros-thanatos linkage. Anxiety around time and lateness pervades the story. Maryam counts the hours as she pines over her brother's fate, while Hamid and the desert refer repeatedly to the perfidies of time. The desert even identifies time as Hamid's enemy. Even Zechariah's seduction of Maryam, the plot's proximate cause, hinges on Hamid's delayed return from an outing to collect rations, with Zechariah repeating over and over to Maryam, "He'll be late." Earlier in the story, when Hamid first appears at home with the clock, he offhandedly accuses Maryam of being late, which she denies, and shortly after we learn that the clock itself is stolen, hinting perhaps at the notion of stolen time. Hamid's wristwatch is a second major symbol of time and temporality. In a pivotal moment in the narrative, in the midst of his perilous desert crossing, Hamid spontaneously throws his watch into the desert, where it continues ticking into the sand. Here, the narration alternates between the perspectives of Hamid and the desert. Hamid says, "I tried to look at my watch, but it was pitch black. As I did so, I came to realize how insignificant a watch is when compared to the absolutes of light and dark. In the infinite expanse of this desert night, my watch appeared to represent a temporal fetter which engendered terror and anxiety. Without hesitation, I unstrapped it from my wrist and threw it away. I heard it hit the earth with a barely audible sound." Desert. It began ticking in my depths with a sad, abandoned sound, like a small iron heart embodied in a giant. As his footsteps finally disappeared away from it, it began imploring for help, isolated as it was beneath the mad gyration of the studded black sky, as though anticipating an imminent mad attack. After a short interlude, the desert turns back to the watch. Its minuscule, tense, and foolish time was spent. As it lay there on the cold pebbles, it seemed the only object in this universe existing outside real time. And indeed, after jettisoning his watch, Hamid narrates, "The black expanse before me was a series of steps no longer measured against the two small hands of a watch." With this statement, Kanafani signals Hamid's break from the time-space of the social order. Yet this movement from the time of the social order to cosmic temporality is also precisely what allows for the reversal of power to occur. As Hamid wanders through the desert in the darkness of night, he happens upon a lost Israeli soldier and overpowers him. He reflexively throws the soldier's machine gun into the desert sand, an action that clearly echoes his earlier decision to jettison the wristwatch. By contrast, he keeps the soldier's knife. At the end of the story, as Hamid knows that it's only a matter of time until the Israeli forces close in on him and the soldier, it occurs to him that he can simply slit his captive's throat, a realization that is synchronized with his sister's stabbing of her abusive lover. The novella closes with the convergence of the two storylines, as the silence in the desert is shattered by the sound of barking dogs, and the silence that follows the stabbing at home when Miriam stabs Zechariah is broken by the oppressive ticking of the clock. There is no doubt that for Kanafani, historical consciousness is conditioned by temporal and spatial experience, and that in All That's Left to You, personal liberation from the oppressive political and social order is linked to the escape from social and political temporality. Both Hamid and Miriam feel trapped by time. Here and elsewhere, Kanafani depicts Palestinian temporality as a narrow opening facing a looming historical closure, and that imparts a sense of urgency. But there's another aspect of temporal experience in Kanafani that's been overlooked. Kanafani was a committed Marxist. Nonetheless, in his literary work, temporality is not extrapolated from the abstract domains of history and ideology. Rather, it's situated within the human body, its meaning emerging biopolitically through the body's interaction with the social world. Kanafani, like Oz, was deeply concerned with the subject's affective and somatic experiences of time and space, as well as the connection between sound and time or silence and time. In All That's Left to You, these are expressed, for example, in Miriam's sensations of fetal movement, and through Hamid's heightened experience of his senses while he's in the desert. These are affects that are directly linked to their temporal consciousness, which in turn underpins the political message of the text. Likewise, readers of Men in the Sun will remember the critical role of time in the body, where life or death by asphyxiation is a matter of single minutes. Men in the Sun was written in 1962 and published in 1963, a year before the formation of the PLO, and it was widely interpreted as a call to action. 3 years later, when All That's Left to You was published, the armed struggle was underway. Now, rather than representing Palestinians as voiceless victims knocking on the sides of a metal tank in vain, Kanafani fashioned an adolescent protagonist who seizes on his destiny by capturing an Israeli soldier. Because each one speaks to the other in his own mutually incomprehensible language, we are denied access to the soldier's consciousness, and by extension, to the story's construction of Israeli temporality. We have access in the story only to Hamid's thoughts about himself and the Israeli soldier. Nonetheless, Hamid articulates their zero-sum struggle in spatial and temporal terms, knowing that the encounter must end in one of two ways. Either the soldier's comrades will shoot him or he will stab the soldier. Hamid muses, only one of us can remain. Or only one of us can remain, you or I. We're going around in a vicious circle, and time can't work against both of us in the same way. They might be nearer to you than I think, but I'm closer to you than they realize. It comes down to a matter of distance and perhaps of time, too. His silent, one-sided dialogue with the soldier is an interlude in an adversarial struggle over time and space. Just before the novella's final act, Hamid apprehends the word Jaffa in Latin letters on the soldier's identity card. The soldier thus becomes Hamid's usurper in a much more immediate sense. Remember, Hamid's family was displaced from Jaffa. Jaffa is both a spatial and temporal marker in that the soldier's Jaffa begins where Hamid's Jaffa ends. "Come on, be good and let's talk about Jaffa," he says to the soldier in the Arabic that the soldier cannot understand. Just then, Hamid hears dogs howling and he understands that the forces are closing in and he has to make his fateful choice. Moving on to Oz. Amos Oz's 1963 story, Nomad and Viper, depicts the encounter of members of an Israeli kibbutz settlement with nomadic Bedouins driven into its proximity by a harsh drought. The kibbutz members' response to the Bedouins in their surrounding desert environs escalates from accusations of petty theft to a violent and unwarranted reprisal raid, the story's denouement. The Bedouins are the living embodiment of the desert, a highly symbolic space within the Israeli national imagination. At the same time, the Bedouins are marginal figures within the Arab population, who in Hebrew literature represent not the politicized Palestinian, the social actor that we find in Kanafani's work, but rather the legacy of Israeli Orientalism. If Kanafani depicts the desert as a space of rebirth and infinitude, a space that inverts power asymmetries, for Oz, the desert is an untamed wilderness, threatening encroachment onto the settled, orderly, and ideologically coherent space of the kibbutz. In Nomad and Viper, an Edenic orchard, a liminal space on the periphery between the settlement and the desert, becomes the site of a phantasmagoric encounter between an unnamed Bedouin and Geula, a Jewish woman from the kibbutz. Though Nomad symbolizes the allure of the wilderness, the Viper appears at the story's end as a reminder of the resilient power that nature can reassert over the kibbutz members. And the snake also completes the story's allusion to the Garden of Eden. This interpretation of the story, which relies on the premise of spatial partition between the kibbutz members and the desert dwellers, has dominated its criticism. In this reading, the schematic spatiality of the Zionist settlement encircled by the wilderness sets the stage for the subversive and destabilizing encounter between Geula and the nomad. So I'm going to offer a different reading, one that assumes that the antithetical spaces of the desert and the kibbutz are not only ideologically codependent or interdependent, but are jointly contained within a single geopolitical space under Israeli sovereignty. And this is a reality that Oz represents through the visual and oral symbols of Israeli military control. We'll get to that. Within this larger shared space, Bedouins and Jews maintain largely separate modes of existence, but they do interact, whether actively through direct social contact, indirectly through infiltration into the other space, or passively through the affects of sound, light, and smell. The story is replete with bodily affects and excess, including sweat, blood, vomit, poison, and the smell of strong coffee. Further, the story's overlooked dimension of temporality can radically change the spatial-based readings of the story, which is what I'm trying to show. Narrated in murky and suggestive language, the story centers on Geula's encounter with the Bedouin and her subsequent delusion that he's attempted to rape her. Her rape fantasy is another typological feature of the colonial script. But what's unexpected is the manner in which this encounter is initiated. The Bedouin, who is presented to us from Geula's perspective as an unindividuated typological presence, she's just called the nomad, Hanavad, approaches Geula by asking her for the time. The nomad stopped behind Geula's back, as silent as a phantom. She saw and heard nothing. For a long time, she continued to kneel on the ground and draw shapes in the dust with her twig. The nomad waited patiently in total silence. His voice was hushed, and the Hebrew he spoke exuded a rare gentleness. "What time is it?" Geula inhaled to her lungs' full capacity. Her features grew sharp, her glance cold. Clearly and dryly, she replied, It is 6:30 precisely. The Arab broadened his smile and bowed slightly, as if to acknowledge a great kindness. Thank you very much, miss. With his familiar pickup line, the Bedouin inscribes himself directly into Geula's temporal domain. His move counters the stereotypical Orientalist characterization of Bedouins and their culture as frozen in a pre-modern time, a cliche that reified the civilizational claims of the Zionist project, but that also figured even within the contemporaneous literature of Arab writers such as Jabra Ibrahim Jabra. Here, his question seems jarringly out of context. Why would a Bedouin tending sheep in the desert need to ask Geula for the time? Throughout this section, Geula maintains the colonizer's superior and condescending posture vis-a-vis the native, who in turn plays the part by bowing and calling her Miss, Giveret. This familiar colonial dynamic is clearly being set up for violent disruption through the forceful release of Geula's libido, as adumbrated a few pages later. Quote, a vague wail came from the nomad encampment away to the south. The dim drum beating time to its languorous call. In Hebrew, it's Vehatofa amum kotsevla neshimata hamitmashechet. Geula pursed her lips and whispered in old tune. The nomad listened to her with rapt attention. She glanced at her watch. The hands winked back at her with a malign, phosphorescent glint, but said nothing. Night. I'm struck here by the oral and visual perceptions of time as illustrated through the rhythmic drum beat, which represents the Bedouin temporality, and Geula's wristwatch, which represents the kibbutz temporality. The drum of the distant Bedouin encampment beats time. So a more literal translation from the Hebrew might read, quote, the dimmed drum gives its prolonged breath a rhythmic beat, rather than beating time, because in the Hebrew, time is not mentioned. It's just implicit in the verb kotsev, to beat or measure time or rhythm. This dim beating of the drum is reminiscent of the ticking of the clock in All That's Left to You. Then the hands on Geula's wristwatch wink and give off a malign glint, and they seem to acquire an ominous agency with the choice to remain silent. We can contrast this with Hamid's discarded wristwatch ticking away in the desert sand. In All That's Left to You, the characters exhibited a persistent anxiety about lateness. In Nomad and Viper, the outcome of the fateful meeting where the kibbutz leadership will decide whether or not to raid the Bedouin community seems to hinge on the punctual arrival of Geula's coffee. After the ambiguous encounter in the orchard, Geula is now returning from the communal showers to her room in order to fetch the coffee that she's going to take to the meeting, when she has a flashback to the imagined rape. She collapses in the bushes, vomits, and is bitten by the viper. As she shivers in the dark, her grasp of her individual temporality opens up into the cosmic and unbounded time of the other. Quote, suddenly she was not in a hurry anymore. Even the coffee no longer seemed important, and she thought to herself, there's still time, there's still time. Yesh zman, yesh zman. The irony is trenchant. Geula, whose name means redemption and connotes the messianic end time, is liberated from her own subordination to a rigid and repressive temporality, as epitomized by the strictly timed ritual of the coffee. But her own mortal time is running out, literally. Moreover, the text implies a connection between the release of her libido and her relinquishing of her control over time. Is this her moment of redemption, as implied by her name, or is it a tragic end? Yet, even in the midst of this moment, Geula cannot escape the omnipresent reminders of social and political control of the state. Her senses are inundated by the sights and sounds of two conflicting social orders of vastly asymmetric power. Quote, those planes sweeping the sky tonight were probably on a night bombing exercise. Repeatedly, they roared among the stars, keeping up a constant flashing, red, green, red, green, red. In a counterpoint came the singing of the nomads and their drums, a persistent heartbeat in the distance. 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, and silence. Again, time is implied through rhythm, much like the ticking of the wall clock or the heartbeat of Hamid's watch in the sand. Here, the visual rhythm of the bombers' alternating lights, the red, green, counterpoised by the aural rhythm of the Bedouins' drums, combine to produce a kind of sound and light show that's performing the clash of two different and incompatible kinds of social existence commingled under a single political hegemony. The narrator then leaves Geula and returns to the committee meeting where the proposed reprisal raid against the Bedouins is being discussed. And he says, from 8:30 until nearly 9 o'clock, we waited for Geula. At 5 to 9, Edkin said that he could not imagine what had happened. He could not recall her ever having missed a meeting or been late before. So the meeting commences. It breaks down into a fractious debate, which ends with the fired-up young men set out, intent on violence. Geula lies passively among the bushes, poisoned by the snakebite, watching the lights of the plains and listening to the sounds of the drums. The story thus ends with this contrapuntal weaving of the teleological, conscripted temporality of the Zionist project with its antithesis, the open-ended and apolitical time of Geula and her body as the poison spreads through it, as nature reclaims it, in the suspended moment between life and eternity. So my conclusion, Nomad and Viper and All That's Left to You share a preoccupation with time and lateness, as well as a violent denouement. In All That's Left to You, where the story's main action takes place in a physically constricted and socially constricting refugee camp in Gaza, the desert offers Hamid a cosmic temporality, an escape from the social political order, and therefore an opportunity to confront his other, the Israeli soldier, and to overcome him. In Nomad and Viper, the desert remains a wilderness associated with Zionism's ultimate other, the nomadic Bedouin. Both narratives present a strong connection between sexual transgression and temporal disruption. This connection is foregrounded in Kanafani's story, which conjoins the clock, sex, and murder. In Oz's story, Geula's erotic encounter with the Bedouin initiates her break from teleological and historical time, which is then accelerated by the fatal snakebite. Pointedly, the two stories have no shared political horizon. Rather, their shared horizon is the rejection of normative social time and the escape to a cosmic open-ended time. In both cases, that move from social to mythic temporality also involves a turn toward lethal violence. If there is a final horizon of commonality between the stories, then it is one of destruction. I suggest that these two stories from the mid-1960s both grapple with time and space in relation to conflicting social and political orders in ways that form an antagonistic dialogue. Through the death of Geula, Oz critiques the temporality of Zionism as a militant return to history. Yet, at the same time, Oz never abandoned Zionism as an ideological frame. And he continuously reinforces the Orientalism of his pre-state predecessors by depicting Bedouins as inhabitants of a separate and primitive temporal order. For Kanafani, if Men in the Sun presents a devastating critique of the temporality of stasis and waiting, a critique that implicitly calls for its own return to history, All That's Left to You builds on this critique by throwing the wristwatch, which symbolizes the perversity of the status quo, directly into the desert sand. If in Men in the Sun, Kanafani warns Palestinians that their time is running out, and then in All That's Left to You, he imagines a Palestinian time beyond the constricting temporality of the present, Oz, for his part, imagines Zionist temporality as a sterile experience of time that can be encountered only by a nihilistic deus ex machina, the Viper, or by the orientalized time of the Bedouin. Both Kanafani and Oz understand Jews and Arabs as subjects of segmented spaces who meet in overlapping liminal spaces, all of which is contained within the space of Israeli military dominion. But they construct Arabs and Jews as inhabitants of divergent temporalities. In each case, the construction of Palestinian or Israeli time is imagined relationally. This, then, is a temporal imaginary that reflects the single-state paradigm. This dialectical temporality is a double helix that intertwines the Nakba, Zionism's return to history, the timeless Arab, and the shared spaces of conflicted experience. Thank you.